communities tend to be, much more progressive because they're very, highly educated. And that correlation is what I'm going to start talking about. So to us, it seems like so many people, everyone's a progressive, right? But only 6% of Americans identify as progressive. Moreover, progressives are the whitest and most highly educated of the groups that make up the Democratic coalition. Again, this is from Pew Research Center. And it's these progressives, these 6%, who have the most woke views on race. So for example, the view that most US laws and major institutions need to be completely rebuilt because they are fundamentally biased against some racial and ethnic groups. That's sort of the question. Do you agree with that or not? That, most US laws and major institutions are so racist that they have to be totally rebuilt. So that is a view that 90% of progressives hold, right? Progressives are just 6% of Americans. Okay, they're just 12% of the whole liberal side of things, the whole Democratic coalition. And you'll never believe how many Black Americans share this view. Again, 6%, just 6% of Black Americans identify as progressive. Black Americans are much more politically moderate, patriotic, and socially conservative than the white progressives advocating ostensibly on their behalf. How did that happen? How did white liberals outpace Black and Latino Americans, and how radical their views are when it comes to race? That's what my book, Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, is about. And I found something surprising while trying to answer this question. I found that the Great Awakening is not about race at all. It is about class. 50 years ago, 40 years ago, the left was the side of the working class. The Democrats were the party of labor. Even 20 or 30 years ago, journalists, college professors, they just didn't make that much more than cops and electricians. But as these industries collapsed, they squeezed those in the middle up to the top 10% while dropping off everyone who didn't make it. Today, America's liberal intelligentsia is affluent. And the whole Democratic side of things, the people that the Democrats are creating messaging for and targeting, are what the French economist calls a Brahmin left, after the highest class in Hindu society, the priests, known as Brahmins. And that's who liberals and their media are increasingly focused on. Suburban white liberals who are affluent and highly educated, not the working class. There's been a reshuffling of who represents which side of this educational divide. You're dealing with Brahmin leftism instead of labor leftism. When a topic takes up a lot of time on our airwaves and gets a lot of play from the squad, but demands no real sacrifice from highly educated, affluent elites. The opposite, it furthers their economic goals at the expense of the working class of all races. So here are some examples of Brahmin leftism. Diversity, equity, and inclusion seminars, open borders or decriminalizing illegal border crossing, banning fracking, defunding the police, or my favorite, forgiving $50,000 in student loans. These issues all sound like social justice, but actually they further the economic agenda of the liberal elite, literally putting money in their pockets at the expense of working class Americans of all races. The Great Awakening is the calling card of Brahmin leftism, and the members of the squad are its patron saints. And none of this would have happened without the media. That's what my book is about. The national mainstream news media has played a crucial role in shifting who the Democrats see as their base, from the working class to a highly educated, college-educated liberal elite. For a long time, the notion that America is an unrepentant white supremacist state, one that confers power and privilege to white people and systematically denies them to people of color, was a view that you found really only among far-left activists and academics. But what the media realized was you use this concept of race, this way of thinking about race that is totally alien in communities of color, is a great way of distracting from the ways in which the left has started to both benefit from an economy that works for the highly educated and also abandon the working class. Over the past decade, this view that America is an unrepentant white supremacy found its way from academia into the mainstream, largely through liberal media outlets like the New York Times, NPR, MSNBC, the Washington Post, Vox, CNN, and the New Republic and the Atlantic. Once distinct publications catering to distinct audiences, what we have now is all of these outlets, which are staggeringly uniform. They are all catering to the same 6, 7, 8 million progressive, educated, affluent readers. And a moral panic around race is one of the things that you see across the board in all of these outlets. And I argue is a sign not that they care about race, but that they're catering to an affluent liberal elite. So for example, you see these articles everywhere. Is the white church inherently racist? The housewives of white supremacy. When Black people are in pain, white people join book clubs. How white women use themselves as instruments of terror, right? This is the bread and butter of the New York Times. The New York Times today had an op-ed about a woman who put up a little, you know, those little boxes, like a little lending library on her lawn. She put up a little thing, and then because a white couple stopped to look at it, she decided that that thing was now white supremacy, right? This is just the bread and butter of the New York Times. We often think of this obsession as stemming from the election of Donald Trump. Trump was so extreme in his disregard of liberal mores, so willing to offend with comments that were actually often racist, that American liberals, including the liberal media, swung hard to the left, right? That's the narrative we often hear. Now, some of this is true. The mainstream media certainly molded itself around Trump, whose presidency was a major gift to MSNBC and CNN and the New York Times. The New York Times specifically and CNN were struggling before Trump and are now doing extremely well, especially the New York Times. But Trump is an insufficient answer. The moral panic about race that's been mainstreamed by the liberal news media has actually been underway for at least 5 years before Trump even appeared on the scene. And this might surprise you. It began around 2011, which was the year that the New York Times erected its online paywall. It was then that articles mentioning racism, people of color, slavery, oppression, marginalization, right? All these woke words started to absolutely skyrocket at the New York Times and BuzzFeed and Vox and the Washington Post and the NPR. And again, you don't have to rely on my impressions that this happened. Sociologists have literally created computer programs that will trawl the archives of all of these outlets so they can count how many times these words appeared. And it was sort of like a hockey stick, right? Up until 2011, you know, people talk about, write about slavery, right? You know, we talk about it. It has a place in our public discourse. Starting in 2011, it went like this. You know, the word white supremacy, something we would talk about in America, and then poof, like this, 2011. And now we're still in that upward swing. Right? Why? You know, it's not like slavery became any more present in America in 2011, right? Like, thank God, that's really something relegated to the past and something we should talk about. But why did we start obsessing over it in 2011, right? That's the question. The media's woke revolution has been impossible to miss if you consume mainstream news that isn't Fox News, but you don't have to rely on your impressions, right? Sociologists found that words like racism, white supremacy, KKK, traumatizing, marginalized, hate speech, intersectionality were skyrocketing. You know, the word white supremacy, for example, was used fewer than 75 times in 2010 in the New York Times and Washington Post, but over 700 times in 2020 alone. Right? NPR was used 2,400 times. The word racism appeared in Washington Post over 4,000 times in 2020. That's the equivalent of 10 articles every single day. This looks like it's a story about race, but it is a story about class. Throughout the 20th century, American journalists underwent a status revolution. Journalism went from being a working class trade to a highly educated caste. This is the story that I tell in my book about how journalism it went from being this blue collar trade, you picked it up on the job, to being something that you essentially have to have a college degree and even a graduate degree to do. And that's not because you need a graduate degree to be a journalist. You don't. You cannot teach journalism. You can only learn it by doing it, by going out. You can't teach someone to be a good listener, to question their biases. How did that happen? How did journalism become the province of the elite? That is the story I tell in my book. American journalism was born in the 19th century in a populist revolution in a form of the penny press, which was explicitly produced by and for the laboring classes. These papers were unignorable because of the hundreds and thousands of Americans who purchased them every day from the lower classes. And even up through the middle of the last century, journalism remained a blue-collar job. This is no longer the case. A 1937 study, 1937, found that less than half of journalists were college educated and many hadn't even finished high school, okay? Fast forward to today, 2015, a study found that 92% of American journalists had a college degree. 92%, a number that's definitely higher today. And college itself is no longer enough. To become a journalist today in a rapidly constricting industry, you have to go to the best colleges. You have to take unpaid internships in the most expensive American cities where the vast majority of journalists stay. But journalists today are not just highly educated and much more liberal than the country at large on issues of identity. Like other highly educated liberals, they have become increasingly affluent. As the local newspaper industry collapsed in the face of the internet, it squeezed those who made it up to the top and dropped everybody else. The fact that the starting salary of a digital media job is so low is not proof that the industry is open and egalitarian, but proof of how exclusive it is. Who but the children of the wealthy can afford to live in New York City or Washington, D.C. on $35,000 a year? And as journalists became part of the elites, they abandoned the working class to which they once belonged and began instead to obsess over race in a great exercise of distraction from the appalling levels of income inequality in America and the great class chasm that has educated elites at the top and the working class sinking lower every single year. And instead of bringing this chasm to the fore, this educational class divide, journalists instead shifted the conversation to race. And not even in a way that actually fights racism, which is something that's really important to do. Instead, they brought an academic framework based on critical race theory with them out of their elite institutions, out of their elite universities, and into newsrooms that were overwhelmingly white, again, for reasons of class, because America's economic elites are overwhelmingly white. Again, a big problem that we have to solve. And many who dissented were driven out of the newsrooms. Now, of course, it's not all the fault of individual journalists. Issues of identity wouldn't be dominating our newspapers and our airwaves if there wasn't a profit at stake. It was only recently that corporate media began to pull in the same direction as their employees obsessing over identity. For a long time, corporations, bosses, right, the heads of newspapers were pulling in the opposite direction of journalists. Before the journalism industry collapsed, it had consolidated. Many towns in America were one-paper towns, and those towns tended to have Americans from across the political spectrum living in them, right? So if you went too far to the left or to the right in your reporting, you would lose half of your potential readers. But if you could report the news straight, you could get the whole town reading your paper. If journalists have always been more liberal than the average American, there was once a very powerful countervailing force in the form of their bosses and the profit motive that was pulling in the other direction towards straight reporting. Then came the internet, and with it, the collapse of the local news industry and the birth of a new business model that was diametrically opposed to the goal of getting the widest circulation. The business incentives of digital media rate success in terms of engagement rather than circulation or ad revenue. And as I'm sure you all know from being on Facebook, the most engaged readers are always the most extreme. Does that make sense? So now, if you are the New York Times, and it used to be you were measuring your success based on how many people were reading you, today on the internet, you're measuring success based on how many people comment on your stories, how many people share your stories on social media. And the more extreme people are always going to share and comment more. So you end up catering to the most extreme and living in fear of upsetting them. That's why everything has moved so quickly, so far in one direction. If once publications had an incentive to cater to the widest possible readership, today many operate in fear of upsetting their most extreme readers and viewers. And while the far left in America was once defined by economic concerns for the less fortunate, today it is defined by issues of identity race and gender that work well to mask the way the left has benefited from the inequality birthed of a class divide that has skyrocketed the fortunes of the college educated. In other words, as journalists became part of the elites, they abandoned the working class to wage a culture war around race that disguised the ways in which affluent liberals and journalists among them have benefited from skyrocketing inequality. The working class of all races is wokeness's biggest roadkill, but we Jews have also been written out of the story. And now I'm going to pivot a little bit to how this impacts the Jewish community. We are in no way paying for the moral panic about race to the same degree as the working class. I want to stress that. We are still the luckiest Jews to ever walk planet Earth, even though anti-Semitism is rising, okay? It is rising, but we are still the luckiest Jews, hands down, to ever exist, the safest Jews to ever exist. I think it's really important not to be in a panic about rising anti-Semitism, but to understand where it's really coming from. In fact, the only Jews luckier than us was us 5 years ago before it started to rise, okay? I think that this rise in anti-Semitism is related to the pressures I've been talking about here. Any worldview that reifies race, that obsesses over race, is going to be bad for Jews. And the anti-racist so-called worldview of Ibrahim X. Kendi, for example, and critical race theory, it pays lip service to the idea that race is not biological, but is a social construct, but it really believes that race is the most important thing. And that's just always going to be a disaster for Jews. We're either going to be considered a race apart and dangerous in that way, or we're going to get put in the white category and forced to loudly proclaim our white privilege while Orthodox Jews are being beaten up in the streets of New York, right? And nobody will call it out because they're quote unquote white. Moreover, anti-Zionism has become the latest plank in this Brahmin leftist elite platform. The latest elite university cooked up, out of touch nonsense being pushed by people like the Squad and their acolytes. And you really saw this last May during the conflagration between Israel and Hamas. In the pages of major publications, from celebrities, actors, musicians, models, and from members of Congress, you saw an unmistakable shift in rhetoric around Israel and Zionists. It has become completely normal on this elite left to talk about Zionism as an ideology of hate, Israel as a genocidal apartheid, and American Jews who support Israel as essentially fair game. And unsurprisingly, attacks on the streets of major American cities, pogroms essentially in liberal cities, soon followed the escalating rhetoric out of Congress in May. Of course, there have always been voices on the far left denouncing Israel as an apartheid and calling Zionists racist, right? This started with the Soviets, we know this story. But now this view has gone mainstream. Now the Washington Post is running op-eds about Israel's settler colonialism, and MSNBC is denouncing Israel for ethnic cleansing. And the New York Times calls it clashes when a gang of pro-Palestinian rioters search for individual Jews on the streets of major American cities to beat them up. Now you have members of Congress blaming Jewish Americans and their money for both Israel's crimes and for the poisoned water in Flint, or calling Israel a terrorist state while implicitly defending Hamas. And just as in America, where the anti-racist project has redefined racism and relocated the problem to a place where it costs little for white liberal elites to do the work combating it, so has this happened in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where real, urgent civil rights abuses against the Palestinians have been obscured by a binary, maximalist, anti-Zionist view of the situation that is now very mainstream on the elite left. So just as defund the police, which is so popular in Park Slope, is opposed by 81% of Black Americans who know the slogan does little more than make sure that they'll never get the police reform they need, so too does the woke moral panic that now encompasses Israel do little to actually help the Palestinians deprived of civil rights, because, spoiler alert, Israel's not going to stop existing because the Squad wants it to, right? The good news is that Americans remain overwhelmingly immune to the leftist malarkey about Israel. The data shows that Americans are still overwhelmingly pro-Israel. despite the fact that their national news media is working overtime to change that. Minorities too remain impressively immune to attempts to tie their struggle to the Middle East. I don't have to explain to you how silly it is to compare Israel's national struggle with multiple Palestinian populations to the racial struggle for equality in the US. That comparison is so repulsive. To suggest that Dr. King's nonviolent movement is somehow on a par with a movement that included the Second Intifada, which resulted in the deaths of 1,038 Israelis, 700 of them civilians. It's appalling. Maybe that's why the largest share of Black Americans and Latinos still sympathize more with Israel than with the Palestinians. And this is from Pew also. And meanwhile, the second largest share of Black Americans are simply ambivalent about the conflict in the Middle East, which is exactly what they should be. In fact, once again, we see that class is the issue. The biggest predictor for whether you support the Palestinians over Israel is whether or not you have a college degree. People with a high school diploma or less are the least likely to support the Palestinians, second only to white evangelicals and followed closely by Black Americans. This is why I don't fear what many others do, that America is turning into Europe when it comes to Jews. I don't see that happening, and not because the Brahmin elite left isn't pushing for that. They are pushing to make it chic to hate Jews, but there's just no buy-in from the working class, just like there isn't for any of their other malarkey. This is not Europe. This is not England, where Jeremy Corbyn can say something about Israel and working class British people who have 1,000 years of being told that their class resentment is about Jews immediately perk up and hear Jews. We are very, very, very blessed. You know, we really have to thank Hashem every day, because Americans are just, we don't have that. There's no buy-in from the working class. America's working class of all races tends to be much more conservative on a host of social issues, no matter who they vote for. They also tend to be much more socialist when you get down to the actual policy proposals that they support, and they are deeply Zionist. The phenomenon of BDS being a sign of class, of belonging to the right groups, is very limited in how far it can spread, and it really does not have much further to go. Again, remember, only 6% of Americans identify as progressive. It is class, not race, not partisanship, that is driving the new language around Israel. It's Brahmin leftism coming out of the universities teaching critical race wokeness. It's highly educated liberal elites distracting from the way in which they have benefited from inequality. The sad thing is that while most Americans see wokeness and the nonsense that it's pushing about Jews and Israel for the nonsense that it is, many liberal American Jews have fallen prey to it. There is a huge crisis in moral authority in the Jewish community, in the liberal Jewish community. Too many Jews have ceded their right to decipher right from wrong to anyone on the oppressed side of the woke binary. Too many Jews have fallen into this trap and now believe that they are part of the problem, upholding white supremacy, Israel's an apartheid or whatever. We absolutely have to fight this, not only on our own behalf. We have to fight it for the reason American Jews have always fought for equality and justice for all Americans, especially poor and working class Black and Latino and white Americans, those who have lost out in an economy that works incredibly well for the highly educated and terribly for everyone else. In other words, American Jews should be opposed to wokeness, not because we are Jews, but because we are American. And we do this by refusing to let the media and our politicians divide us, by insisting on the truth that more unites us as Americans than divides us, and by pushing with every fiber of our beings to make this a more perfect union. If anything here has spoken to you at all, I hope you'll buy my book. And I'm very excited now to discuss these ideas with you.
Wow, that was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I mean, you brought up so many different ideas. I do see we have a couple chat questions, but let me ask before, how did the academic left get so powerful and anti-Semitic is one of the big quandaries that I always think about. I mean, I'm overeducated and all the rest, but regardless, how is it the universities now, even Jewish universities, are becoming anti-Semitic? is there a rationale for this?
The argument I make in my book is that the media has played a big role in it. That as the media, so it used to be you would have academics doing their, academic malarkey here in the university. And I say this as a person with a PhD. So I feel like I have the authority to say that like PhDs are nonsense, especially in the humanities. So, you had sort of academics sort of safely ensconced in their ivory tower coming up with their, kooky ideas. And then you had a mainstream media that was made up of, both people with college degrees, but also a lot of people who didn't have a college degree, right? And so the media was speaking to all Americans. What happened over the last 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, 5 years is that the media, the people, journalists have become increasingly highly educated as journalism as an industry collapsed. There are much fewer jobs, and each of those jobs can go to a much more highly educated elite person, right? Because they have the pick of the barrel, and they've been picking, instead of picking people from middle America who can tell you what America is really like, they've been picking from the highly educated. And as these people have come into newsrooms with these very rarefied elite university degrees, they have brought those ideas with them into the mainstream, right? So if it used to be that the people on your TV, if they had a college degree, their boss didn't, right? Or that college degree was from, a state school. Now the people on your TV, their boss, the people under them, the people angling for their job have gone to elite universities, and they've brought all those ideas with them. But I really think that without this class divide, you wouldn't be seeing this at all.
Thank you. I have a couple chat questions, and then Martin, I'll answer you, let you ask. One of the questions is, what about the role of social media? Have they way more power than the New York Times or the WAPO?
The New York Times has as much power as it needs. It has ceded power to Twitter. That is something that has happened. We've seen that the New York Times now makes personnel decisions based on whether or not there's a Twitter mob, often made up of its own employees, right? But that was a very explicit choice that the New York Times made. So in 2014, the New York Times had a very bad year. And the guy who's now the publisher, who's now in charge, A.G. Sulzberger, he was tasked with coming up with he wasn't the publisher yet, and he was tasked with coming up with an analysis of like why the New York Times was not doing better at digital media. And he specifically wrote in his recommendations that he wanted to see journalists becoming social media stars. He wanted to see them essentially taking over on social media and having all this power to share their work. So he wanted them to be rewarded for doing that, right? So essentially what the New York Times did was it rewarded journalists for going out there and becoming big on social media. So it consciously ceded journalistic authority to Twitter and to social media. Now you could imagine a world in which the New York Times was like, wait a minute, we're the New York Times, we're the paper of record, like journalistic authority must remain with us. Why would we give that to the worst place on the planet, which is Twitter, right? You could so easily imagine a world in which the New York Times had the courage of its convictions, but no, they very consciously went, they followed the money, and the money was, with the most engaged, most elite, liberal readers. And that's very much on social media. Great question.
Okay. Apart from buying your book, what can we do individually to fight wokeism?
I love that question, because it's, as a religious Jew, I'm sure, it's a spiritual answer. Like, you can refuse to demonize your fellow Americans. You can refuse. That's where this begins and ends. You can insist on the dignity of the people you disagree with. You can do that every day. Let me tell you something. Every time you're on the internet, you're on social media, you're reading something and you see something that makes you enraged, you feel that feeling, it like feels like road rage, right? Like, it's very physical. It's not natural to feel that way about a stranger. Every time you feel that, someone is making $1 million. And I'm not exaggerating. We have been hacked. Our hearts have been hacked. Social media companies and the media are using our hearts, our souls, to turn us against our fellow Americans and make us hate them. And they're getting rich off of this. And they're trying to destroy this country. And it's the worst part of it is it's coming at a time when we have never had more in common with our fellow Americans. Yes, they're able to find things that make us disagree, vaccine mandates, Trump, whatever it is, right? But at the end of the day, on the most important things, on fighting racism, on equality, on the dignity of every human, that we're all created equally, that we're all created perfectly by God, and that we are all perfect, like that, these ideas, like we all share them. You can refuse to let your heart be the place that someone else is making millions of dollars by making you hate someone just because they voted for somebody else. Politics doesn't matter. None of this matters.
Martin.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, first of all, for a terrific talk. I learned a great deal. And this is important, you just sold another book.
Thank you.
But now you're going to get angry at me, even though I'm going to buy your book. I am not the elite left, but I still think that Israel is not perfect in their treatment of their 2.2 million Arab Israelis. And then another comment where I disagree with you, actually. I know young US Jews very well. I've taught at universities for 50 years, at American universities. Most US Jews intermarry. Most US Jews hardly think about Israel. They don't go to synagogue. My kids, my 3 boys, they're in the 40s now, married with grandkids, intermarried, and they're in that group. You give the impression that there's another group of young people that think about Israel all the time. That's all I wanted to say.
Oh, thank you so much. So first of all, I totally agree with you about Israel and the Palestinians. I actually don't think that anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic. I think it's very important that Palestinians be allowed to be anti-Zionists without being called anti-Semitic or bigots. You know, like Israel came at their expense, and it seems to me wrong to insist that they be Zionists. I agree with you that Israel has a problem. I think Israel has 3 problems. It has 3 different Palestinian problems. There are the Palestinian citizens of Israel that only have 95% of the same rights as Jewish citizens of Israel. That's not okay. That's a problem. There's an occupation in the West Bank. That's not okay. That's a problem. And there's a punishing military, and there's a blockade of Gaza. No child growing up in Gaza has a future. That's not okay either. Where I differ from the wokes is that I don't see Israel as having all the power. It has more power, certainly, and thus more responsibility. As a lefty, I can't help but feel that way. But it doesn't have all the power. The Palestinians have some power. They have less, but they have agency. They have made choices. They've made bad choices. It's not all on Israel. And when you conflate those 3 problems, right? Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, you conflate all of those into one problem and compare it to the racial problem we have in America, ensuring the dignity and equality of Black Americans. The only answer that the left will be happy with is if Israel ceases to exist. That's the only way you answer all 3 of those problems with the same answer. And so I think that the problem with anti-Zionism is that it's woke and stupid and immoral, but I wouldn't say it's inherently anti-Semitic. And I totally agree with you that Israel has a big problem with the Palestinians. I pray every day that it's solved. I have deep connections in the Palestinian community. And so I totally take your point. The other point, that's such a great point. You're right. Most American Jews, the problem is that they don't think about being Jewish or being Israel enough. And I totally agree with you. I think everyone should go to shul and keep Shabbos and kosher. I'm totally on board with you. Like that stuff's really important to me. And, you know, I often, you know, when I see, and please forgive me, but you know, I think that so much of what passes for Judaism in America is really just liberal politics. And when I look at the richness of our texts and our tradition, like, my God, like we're the people who invented the book of Jonah. We created the Talmud. Like I think that there was a big mistake that, you know, going all in on birthright, for example, was really a mistake, because we should have gone all in on education, on teaching Jews how to read Aramaic and Hebrew. I mean, you'll never meet, you know, an Orthodox Jew who doesn't love Israel. So it seemed like we sort of went the wrong way. We should have gone all in on education and observance, and Israel would have come very naturally caring about it. So this is all just to say, Martin, thank you for your comments. I totally agree with you. So and thank you for buying the book.
Thank you.
Okay. Herb asks, is it not a fact that unfortunately today facts are out of the window and personal perceptions become the reality?
It's a great question. I personally don't think that a partisan media is an emergency if everyone is represented. So American journalism started in a very partisan way, but it was partisan on behalf of the poor and the working class. And that was great. Like they had a voice through the media, but that media was partisan on their behalf. The problem with today is that it's partisan on behalf of the elites. So right-wing media is very much catering to a right-wing economic elite, and then left-wing media is catering to a liberal elite. And to get to the question, that becomes a problem because the 90% aren't represented. But the right is very good at fact checking the left, and the left is very good at fact checking the right. So I think that's why you haven't seen more of this. Like, for example, what happened with the Steele dossier, right? I don't know if you guys were following this, but very recently it was revealed that one of the central components of the Russiagate story was revealed to have been essentially a hoax, the Steele dossier that claimed to show that Trump was in bed with Russia. Now, guys, don't get the wrong impression. I'm not like I'm not sitting here defending him, but I think that the way in which the media treated him was really problematic. There really was a lot of like, oh, this is too delicious to fact check, we're going to run with the Steele dossier, and then now it comes out that it wasn't true. But if you were watching Fox News, like the whole time they were saying like, this is a hoax, this is a hoax, this is a hoax, right? So there are voices out there sort of doing that fact checking. Obviously, like back in the day, the Walter Cronkite era, when you had people of all classes and all, both sides watching the same news source, things were simpler. It was like a simpler time. But I'll just make that point again, that to me, the Walter Cronkite era was not, he wasn't uniting right and left so much as he was uniting working class, middle class, and elites. And the problem today is that you really have that sorting where the Republicans somehow are the ones speaking for the working class. Like, I don't know how that happens. And I don't know how any liberal is okay with that. People will often say to me, like, these are just conservative talking points to try to hurt my feelings. I'm like, first of all, being conservative, that's not a slur. I'm not conservative, I'm a socialist. But I'm happy to be a conservative. I'm not offended by being called that. I don't think it's accurate. But if the left wants to say that caring about class is a conservative viewpoint, they're essentially ceding the whole fight to the right, right? They're essentially saying the right are the only people who care about inequality in class. Like, is that really what we want to say for our side? No, we should fight for these issues. But, if you say, I'm currently getting ratioed on Twitter for saying that $50,000 in student loan forgiveness is a bailout for elites, nobody wants to hear that. If you talk about class and, among liberals on the left, it's like you get thrown out. And I think that that's I refuse to cede this issue. This is the great issue of our time. Okay,
now we'll go to Martin's wife's question. Okay, Martin, listen to this. Sabrina says, you have the right and the left off the hook. You have left the right off the hook. What about the right press extremism? What damage have they done?
So it's such a great question, and I really appreciate the opportunity to answer this question. It's really important to me. I watch CNN and Fox News all day. I'm an opinion editor for Newsweek, so that means I have to follow the conversation. I have, very depressing, I know, but I have one screen of Fox, one screen of CNN, and then I'll put on MSNBC if I really want to, if I really feel like I need to do tshuva for something, And I can tell you that the difference between Fox and CNN, it's not politics and it's not race and it's not fact. And I'm telling you this as someone who just watches it all day long. It's class. Fox News is picturing a working class viewer. It's picturing a viewer that doesn't have a college degree, and CNN is picturing a viewer who has a college degree. That is the main difference. Now, of course, when you get to the nighttime opinion shows, things are very different, right? But I wouldn't say that the nighttime Fox shows are less crazy than Rachel Maddow, who was pushing this Steele dossier Russia conspiracy for 5 years and is now conveniently getting off the air. Opinion journalism is opinion journalism. It's supposed to be opinionated. But the daytime Fox shows, I can tell you that, like I said, they've celebrated the Ahmaud Arbery thing. They called Joe Biden president-elect the day after the election. I watched them all day during the insurrection. They were dismayed. They got every single Republican they can get their hands on to get on TV and condemn the insurrection. I mean, it's the real difference is it's about class. It's not about race. It's not about politics. Oh, and they call out anti-Semitism, which you really won't see anymore on CNN or MSNBC. So, Harris Faulkner at the, 11 o'clock hour was talking about the pogroms against Jews, and you just didn't see that anywhere else. So I really, I do, you know, to me, the problem with the Republican media is that because the liberal media abandoned the working class, the Republican media has a lock on that audience, and they don't push for their economic concerns. That bothers me a lot. They have all these working class viewers, and they don't push unions. You know, they don't push for higher minimum wage. They don't push for dignified labor for the working class. They're still pushing this trickle down economics crap, right? But the liberals aren't giving anything either. They're not giving a pro working class agenda. They're giving expanded welfare. That's not a pro working class agenda. Working class people don't want welfare. They want dignified jobs. They want jobs that they want to be an active part of building up this great nation, and neither side is giving them that. So but at least one side is not insulting their views, insulting their values, and smearing them as racist day in and day out while abandoning them economically. You know, my book opens with a scene from CNN, and the scene is two CNN hosts. One of them is worth $10 million and one of them is worth $25 million, Don Lemon and Kirsten Powers. And they're just sitting there back and forth going, ha ha, every person who voted for Trump is so deeply racist. And that's the primal scene of this book. You're a millionaire and you're sitting there sneering at the voters of a man who won 67% of people without a college degree, people who are committing deaths of despair because they no longer see a role for themselves in America. They're literally committing suicide, death by alcoholism, death by opioid addiction, death by refusing the vaccine, because they can no longer see themselves as part of this great nation. And you're sitting there sneering at them, having won by every metric that they've lost at. So I think, you know, you don't get that on Fox. So yeah, it's true. Fox doesn't really, it's the dignified labor is sort of like, you know, it's hard for them to work their head around that, but at least they're not sneering at them and smearing them. And that's what my book is about. It's about contempt. How did we, the liberals, the lefties, allow ourselves to develop so much contempt for people who are losing by every metric that we're winning by?
Okay, let's have Jack ask his question, and then Jeff.
Hi, thank you very much. I really like your passion, even though I think you're wrong. Okay.
Thank you.
You know, I do think the last question was right. I listen to Fox News all the time, and I listen to CNN all the time. A couple recent things came up. Did you watch the interview with Chris Christie and Nicole Wallace last?
No, I missed that. Tell me. Tell me.
Chris Christie has written a book
mm-hmm.
where he debunks all this various conspiracy theories and everything, and he goes into great detail. But Nicole Wallace apparently read the book and said, but you don't mention Fox News one time.
Mm-hmm.
And he really didn't have a good answer. And he basically said, well, when you write your book, you can talk about Fox News.
I talk about Fox in my book. I just want to say that there's a whole chapter on it.
Now, did you watch Fox News last week when they had Lara Logan on there?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
What'd you think of that?
I thought that was terrible. I hope that she'll be disciplined. She's been pulled from the air, so we'll see what happens. But yeah, that's terrible. People, yeah, that's a huge mistake. It's disgusting for everybody.
I'm getting yelled at here, but I just want to ask you one last question.
Yeah.
Do you think there's institutional racism in the United States?
So just for everybody who doesn't know what Lara Logan said, she is a Fox Nation host, which is their website streaming service. And she said that Dr. Fauci is like Dr. Mengele. And I called her out on Twitter, and I really hope that there will be some sort of action, because you're absolutely right. That was disgusting. I mean, Holocaust minimization is unacceptable. Do I think there's institutional racism? Absolutely. I mean, I started with, mass incarceration, police brutality, I think is a real problem in America. I don't think that the data shows that police do not shoot to kill Black Americans more than white Americans when you control for poverty. So they shoot to kill poor people more than not poor people, but not poor Blacks more than poor whites, but they do insult Black people more, lay hands on them more, put them in handcuffs more, throw them against cars more, arrest them more, obviously pull them over more. I mean, this is a moral emergency. So I would call that institutionalized racism, because they are state actors who have been, who have a monopoly on the use of force. So that's a real problem, and we should all be we should all care about that. And we do all care about that, right? You know, especially in the wake of George Floyd's murder, you saw Republicans standing up and speaking up against that, specifically about police brutality. So I would say, yes, that's an instance of institutionalized racism. I think as well, mass incarceration, the justice system, the way that it so clearly is weighted in the favor of the rich against the poor. And we, you know, what we know about the disparities in income. So I would say those are two glaring examples. I think the way that the public school system is essentially segregated in liberal cities is another example of institutionalized racism. New York City's public school system is more segregated than Alabama's, and I find that to be something that is, you know, at the state level, and so the state should be taking care of that. So I would say, yeah, those are three pretty good examples. There's probably a few others.
I have a question for you. After listening to your talk, I guess I'm not really a progressive. I guess I'm a democratic socialist, okay, rather than a progressive, okay. But, you know, the evil that I see that's occurring, and again, it's just a talking point, is that the Republican states are making it so hard for people to vote, and we're trying to make the country more equal. But with all these laws that are going to be passed, do you think that that's just one of the ways of continuing to make the country unequal? And then when are the people going to wake up? It's the corporations that are ruling the country, and not so much the politicians. And the other thing I listened to the other way, the left can't get anything done in America because we have the lawyers are always preventing something getting done.
Man after my own heart. It's definitely the corporations. I totally agree with you. About the Voting Rights Act, look, I wish they were not pushing that. I think that voting rights are really important. We should be making it easier, not harder to vote, but I resist the idea that it's somehow racist. It will possibly impact people who are, I think that, you know, it's the argument that they're making that, you know, you should be able to get your hands on an ID before going to vote. I wouldn't have gone that route because I don't think that there is a lot of voter fraud. But for people who worry about voter fraud, I don't think that that's an unreasonable thing to ask. So if that's what you're talking about, I feel like I wish both sides would lay off that topic. It seems like the Democrats are overblowing their response to it, even though it's something I don't particularly support. But I do think it's a legitimate thing to pursue. If you're talking about the ways in which they've you know, the things related to voter fraud, about like Stop the Steal, the new legislation that you can replace, you know, the people in charge of counting ballots, etc. Yeah, again, I mean, it's like we, you know, educated elites, like we can look at the data and very easily surmise that, you know, voter fraud is very small. But I think we should, how to put this, like, to the extent that we in our hearts can find room to sympathize with people who are worried about voter fraud, who are worried about the weakening of their votes, I think we should. That's not a satisfying answer. I'm sorry. It's a good question.
Okay. Karen asks, I view progressives as more socialistic and therefore not beneficial to the rich. I guess she's asking, how are they benefiting by trying to control everything?
Oh, it's such a good question. It's such a good question. And the answer is so annoying. It's like, okay, so when I say I'm a socialist, I don't mean what, like, you look at, okay. The problem with today's socialists, the people who call themselves socialists, is that they don't actually care about class, which is what socialism is supposed to be about. They care about things like, you know, like free college, right? Free college is the opposite of socialism. Like socialism is supposed to be about making sure that working class people who work with their hands have dignity, that they can support their families doing the jobs that we all rely on to exist. Like the pandemic made nothing more clear than the fact that we in the pajama class were able to sit at home typing out tweets like, stay home, slow the spread, because we were able to pay people to bring us food, right? Like that was the trick of it, right? Like getting high on our own virtue while relying on the labor of, you know, first responders and essential workers, right? And then sneering at them when they were like, well, look, I managed to not get COVID this long, like, you know, I'm going to keep doing my thing. No, you have to do it our way, right? We, the pajama class, who stayed home. Like it's so, oh God, I forgot the question. I was like getting so revved up and high on my own outrage. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sure. Wait, what was the question? I moved it around here. Hold it.
Oh, yes,
progressives. Yeah, progressives as more
exactly,
socialist and therefore not beneficial to the rich.
You look at the things that someone like AOC, who calls herself a socialist, is pushing. You would not recognize socialism in them because they are all punishing the working class and rewarding the elites, right? So she's like obsessed with environmentalism and banning fracking. Fracking, let me tell you, is one of the few working class jobs left that is like a pathway directly into the middle class. You know, what they always pick the things that it's so weird to me. How do you call yourself a socialist and push free college? Like, college is not a way to give a working class person a dignified life. It's a way of making sure there's no working class, right? Send all the first responders, all of the essential workers to college. Well, then who's going to be the essential worker? You don't need a college degree to be a delivery person, but America needs delivery people. I guess the idea is we're going to import them from some other country, but it just doesn't work that way. The economy right now, there is no growth in the industries that require a college degree, and there is huge growth in the industries that don't require a college degree. Why aren't we focused on making sure that those jobs pay $20, $25 an hour? Why are we putting all of our money in forgiving student loans for elites? But that is what's called socialism today. So I reject that. I'm like, no, I'm a socialist. That means being like Trump. Actually, his economic agenda was very pro working class. He was very protectionist in nature. Trade war with China, do it. You know, tariffs, do it. Let's bring manufacturing back to America. Let's control that border instead of allowing 125,000, you know, low-skilled laborers to cross the border every month and compete with Americans for jobs. Like, it's just so nuts that socialism today is open borders. What could be less socialist? You know, like, how are you going to take care of your own working class when what you're saying is we're just going to import the working class of another country, when there's no jobs here for people, for our own people? So I feel like, to me, socialism means like doing what someone like Josh Hawley is saying. Like, you know what? I'm going to make a new law. 50% of everything that gets sold in America has to be made in America. Boom. Let's bring manufacturing back. That's a socialist agenda. That's a good socialist to me. Green New Deal, that's not socialism. Free college, student loan forgiveness, that tells you who the Democrats see as their base. And it's not the working class, you know? And it's not the fault of the Republicans that we've abandoned these people and they're showing up and sweeping up, you know?
Thank you very much for your talk. And I do have your book already. You've really dissected the news media dramatically from everything I hear and from what I've read. Seems to me all we're getting is propaganda. How does an average person decide what is news and what is not? And there are 24-hour news channels all the way around. So my gut instinct is to ignore everybody and just look at the facts. And how do we get facts rather than opinions?
It is such a great question. My answer is very unsatisfying. I think that we know too much about what's going on. I think we're all consuming too much news. I think that we've replaced community and spirituality with information, and we're all addicted to being like up on the know, like, you know, every day, oh, let's open the Politico newsletter and find out who AOC is angry at today. It's like there's so much out there that you don't need to know, and so much that you do need to know that you can only learn from your fellow Americans, from the people in your community. So I know this is a funny thing for someone who works in the media to say, but I think we're all consuming way too much media and it's just making us sick. And that the best thing we can do is sort of tune out a little bit. You know, like I'll give you another example, like all this Build Back Better, right? And the big infrastructure bill. Like, those bills are going to pass, you know, big infrastructure bill passed. Build Back Better is either going to pass or not pass. Like, you don't actually have to think about it until then. And all that happens is like, you don't actually even hear the important information, like that they put back the SALT deductions, right? Like this huge tax cut for liberal, you know, rich people. You don't even hear that stuff if you're just following the news. Exactly like you said, you get a lot of propaganda. You get CNN having people on, you know, from the Democratic Party supporting it or not support, you know, people from the Republican Party on Fox News talking about how, oh, this is all socialism, which, trust me, it's not. Like, if only, you know, Halavai, Build Back Better was socialist, you know? So I would just say, like, it's, you know, if you need to know something, like you'll find it out, like somebody in your community will tell you. And just this obsession with like knowing everything and getting everything right, I feel like we should all just like take a step back and spend more time outside.
I thank you for your talk. It was wonderful, but you opened up talking about how as Jews we're living in this wonderful time, but as a 75-year-old kid who grew up in a Jewish world, it seems like we're getting less and less Jewish. Our children, our synagogues, and maybe we need to learn more about the Torah than we need to know about politics. So I just wanted your questions and how we as a Jewish tribe could still keep, as you say, we're living this wonderful time, but yet I see things going downwards, not upwards.
It's such a great question. I think throughout Jewish history, whenever they gave us the opportunity to assimilate, we did. We took it, right? Like this isn't a unique thing to us. Like a lot of our survival, I think, has to do with anti-Semitism and the fact that like they didn't let us in, they oppressed us, and so we were stuck with each other. But throughout history, whenever there was a moment, we did the last day of Hanukkah today, right? Like, well, it's another example of just like, the Greeks were like, hey, join us, and they were like, we're coming, like, so that, that's something that happens. I honestly don't think about it. It could be sad personally to somebody to see their children not observing, not finding meaning in Judaism. But to me, like, we will always have, thank God, the state of Israel. We will always have religious observant Jews everywhere. Judaism is not in danger of being lost, and Jews are not in danger of being lost. If a person chooses not to identify with this tradition, it's sad to me, but that's not a really like a big crisis. It's, if we fail to convey the meaning in our tradition to the next generation, it's, that's not something that keeps me up at night, because I think that the, civil rights abuses, like murder, people, threatening us and saying, you're not allowed to be a Jew, right? Like that stuff is really like urgent. To me, it's like, what you do is you just keep trying to convince, to show where the meaning lies for you and hope that it catches on. And if it doesn't, like, rest assured, like, Hashem's taking good care of us. And again, like our future is bright. The future of, the reform movement may not be, I don't know. I'm not a soothsayer. I don't know what's coming in the future, but Judaism in some version, of course, it has a very, very bright future. So I would take comfort in that.
Very good. A question, I'm thinking about J Street and some of the views that they've taken, which are more or less anti-Israel, even though they propose to be pro-Israel. What's your feeling about this? And how did they get these ideas that are alien to everyone, or at least to me?
With J Street, it's very interesting. I think they have a real branding problem because, like, the messaging, I hear what you're saying. It feels really alien, but at the end of the day, the idea that a two-state solution is a pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian agenda, that is where most American Jews hope to see Israel end up. That is very much, that is 2/3 of American Jews have that view, right? We're two-staters. So it's funny that J Street has managed to have the view of 2/3 of American Jews while also conveying that view in a way that feels really anathema. And I hear that a lot from a lot of Jews, that they don't feel represented by J Street, even though the platform, the agenda, the idea that, being pro-Israel means being pro-peace, means being, for a Palestinian state, like that's sort of seems so obvious. I think a lot of the messaging has become very woke, and the reason for that is because J Street sees its mission as being making the case for Israel on the Hill, for a two-state solution on the Hill, and they see the increasing power that people like the Squad have there. Now, what's very interesting is what you just saw, which is that Congressman Jamal Bowman went on a J Street trip to Israel, visited with Palestinian leaders, visited with Israeli leaders, came back here, and the Democratic Socialists of America want to kick him out for daring to speak to Israelis at all. And I wonder if that's going to make them rethink this idea that, catering to the Squad and that type of person by making a woke case for Israel is the right thing to do. I definitely think that was a legitimate choice. But to me, the better choice is just to reject it. And it comes back to something else, which is that many Jews have bought into wokeness, but they want the woke people to acknowledge that Jews are also oppressed, or that Jews are also a minority, or that Jews also have a history of being oppressed. And I think that's a huge mistake. Like, you know, you see a lot of Jews like begging for admission to the progressive movement and being like, why don't you want us? Like, we're also progressives. And I'm just like, why are you sitting here begging a movement that hates you to accept you? Why are you trying to convince people that we're oppressed? We're not. I mean, we're not. We're powerful and we know who we are. And who we are is we are the rejection of wokeness on behalf of an America that needs us, you know?
I agree with you so much. I can't tell you. Does anybody else have a question? I was going to ask something else, kind of, but because I'm getting senile, I'm escapes my. I do see that you have to leave. Is that correct?
Yeah, but it looks like Karen Zilberstein's husband is waving his hand.
Okay.
We'll do one more question.
Okay. Sorry.
What motivates these progressives? What is there a profit motive? What's the motive? Because I'm interested in your presentation, but confused by it.
Yeah.
Because I thought I was on that side, and you're painting a picture that I don't relate to and I don't understand. What if they have a profit motive? They have a ideology motive? What are they doing? What are they trying to do?
That's such a great question. I'm not a psychologist. I am a former woke though. I was very woke for a while. So I can only say, like, when I was woke, I really, really felt that if I was not talking about race in this very binary way every single moment of the day, I was harming people of color. That I totally bought into that. And it feels so deep, and like the white guilt, the guilt that I have for the ways in which we continue to treat Black Americans is very strong. And it's very hard to realize you don't fix that by patronizing them and treating them like they're have no autonomy, right? Like, that's not how you fix those problems. You fix them by standing up for their dignity, which is what I think I'm doing and what I think the progressives are not doing. But it's very hard because the influencers that are allowed through from those communities are only the ones who comport with the white liberal view. And so you have to actually go into the Black community, go into the Latino community to find out that they reject this woke view. So I think that the motivation in more cases than not, even with the squad, is very pure. It's just a case of the best intentions leading in the worst place. And I think that there is a profit motive as well. I don't think they're motivated by it. Yuval Levin has this great line: Washington would be a much easier place to navigate if every person showed up and went, "Heh, heh, heh, I'm going to get all the money and the power." And the problem is that everybody shows up and goes, "I'm going to make the world a better place." And I really think that that's what's motivating it. And so we have to really have a lot of compassion in our attempts to convince them otherwise.
Very good. Thank you.